The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of Belvedere, casting amber light across white tablecloths and polished silverware. Grace moved between tables in the main dining room, her hands working methodically to straighten a crooked fork, adjust a water glass that sat 1 inch too far from its proper position. 20 years of muscle memory guided every motion. She had just reached table 7 when Richard Caldwell's voice cut through the refined atmosphere like broken glass. He stood near the entrance with Mr. Harrison, a regular patron who had dined at Belvedere every Thursday for the past decade. His face twisted in theatrical disgust as he pointed directly at Grace. The words came loud enough for the early dinner guests to hear clearly. "She cannot serve you tonight, Mr. Harrison. She is not qualified to interact with our distinguished clientele. She belongs in the back where she has always belonged, handling the tasks more suited to her capabilities." Grace felt every eye in the room turn toward her, the weight of their attention pressing against her shoulders. Mr. Harrison shifted uncomfortably, his mouth opening as if to protest. But Richard had already snapped his fingers in her direction, a gesture one might use with a disobedient dog. Grace met his gaze for 3 steady seconds, her expression revealing nothing of the storm beneath, then turned and walked toward the kitchen doors with the same measured pace she had maintained for 2 decades. Richard smiled at Mr. Harrison, his hand already guiding the older man toward a different table, his voice dropping to a more pleasant register, as if the cruelty of the previous moment had never existed. "Please support us by liking the video and subscribing to the channel." Grace had arrived at Belvedere 20 years ago on a cold morning in October, her interview scheduled for 8 o'clock sharp with James Thornton himself. The restaurant had been quieter then, less well known, its reputation still building in a neighborhood that had only just begun its transformation into the upscale district it would become. She remembered standing outside the locked front door, her hand trembling slightly as she checked her watch for the 4th time in 2 minutes, wondering if she had made a mistake about the date. Then the door had opened, and James stood there in his shirt sleeves, flour dusting his forearms, his eyes crinkling with the kind of smile that reached all the way to the soul. He had hired her that day, not for the dishwashing position she had applied for, but for something he called a comprehensive role, one that would allow her to learn every corner of the operation from the ground up. The years that followed had been education unlike any other. Grace learned how to select produce at the farmer's market before dawn, how to recognize when meat had been stored at improper temperatures, how to read the subtle tensions between kitchen staff that signaled larger problems brewing beneath the surface. She memorized the preferences of regular customers, knew which ones required gluten-free preparations before that term became commonplace, which ones celebrated anniversaries on the 3rd Tuesday of May and expected their favorite corner table without having to ask. The other staff members came to rely on her presence, the way she could locate a missing corkscrew in seconds or remember that the Johnson party had specifically requested no pepper in their preparation last time they visited. Grace lived simply, her 1-bedroom apartment in a modest building 3 bus stops away, her closet containing 5 identical sets of dark slacks and comfortable shoes. She sent money home to her sister each month, helped put her niece through community college, never complained about the early mornings or late nights when inventory needed counting. The work satisfied something deep within her, a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with the wages she earned. Richard Caldwell had arrived 5 years ago with expensive shoes and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. James had introduced him to the staff as the new general manager, a man with impressive credentials from restaurants in New York and Chicago, someone who would help take Belvedere to the next level of success. Richard had shaken hands with the front-of-house staff, complimented the sus chef on a sauce technique, but when his eyes passed over Grace, they seemed to look through her rather than at her, as if she occupied the same category as the industrial dishwasher or the walk-in freezer. Within a month, the subtle changes began. Richard implemented new scheduling systems that somehow always assigned Grace to the earliest morning shifts and the latest evening cleanup, maximizing her hours in the restaurant when no customers were present. He created a new hierarchy that placed her firmly at the bottom, despite her 2 decades of experience and the institutional knowledge she carried in her bones. During staff meetings, he would ask for input from everyone except Grace, his eyes skipping over her raised hand as if it existed in a dimension he could not perceive. She watched him purchase ingredients from cheaper suppliers, watched him alter Jameis' carefully crafted recipes to reduce costs, watched him create a culture where certain staff members received preferential treatment while others found themselves working double shifts for the same pay. The front-of-house team, particularly those who had been hired in the past 3 years, began to mirror Richard's attitudes. They stopped asking Grace for advice, stopped including her in the casual conversations that happened during quiet moments between lunch and dinner service. Sarah, a server who had joined the team 2 years ago, seemed to take particular pleasure in emphasizing the distance between their positions, making sure to use phrases like "you are just the cleaning staff" or "people like us" when the managers are not around when speaking within Grace's earshot. Richard had become a shareholder 18 months ago, purchasing 15% of the company from a departing investor, then adding another 20% when Jameis' health began to decline. He spoke openly about his plans to own the restaurant outright, his vision for transforming Belvedere into something more modern and profitable, though what he meant by those words seemed to involve primarily the elimination of what he called unnecessary labor costs and outdated sentimentality. The history between Grace and James Thornton contained chapters that no one at Belvedere had ever read. 25 years ago, Grace's mother had worked as a nurse at St. Catherine's Hospital, where she had been assigned to care for Jameis' wife during her final battle with cancer. In those terrible months, Grace's mother had shown kindness that went far beyond her professional duties, sitting with Mrs. Thornton through long nights of pain, reading to her when morphine made her own vision swim, advocating fiercely with doctors who seemed ready to give up. James had never forgotten that compassion, and when Grace's mother died in a car accident 3 years later, he had attended the funeral, standing in the back row in a dark suit, waiting until the other mourners had left before approaching Grace with an offer that seemed to come from another world entirely. He would pay for her education, whatever she wanted to study, wherever she wanted to go, no strings attached except one. She must never tell anyone about his involvement, must accept the gift as if it had come from a scholarship or her own savings, must carry the secret as carefully as she would carry a flame through wind. Grace had been 22 years old, working 2 jobs to support herself and her younger sister, her dreams of college fading into the practical necessities of survival. She had looked at James Thornton's weathered face, at the genuine sorrow in his eyes, and said yes. Columbia Law School had accepted her application 6 months later, and for the next 4 years, Grace had lived a double life, studying contracts and constitutional law, while telling her sister and friends that she was attending a local business program part-time. James had paid every bill, every fee, every cost associated with her education, and in return, Grace had sent him letters detailing what she learned, how the law worked to protect the vulnerable and punish the powerful, how justice was supposed to function even when it so often failed. When she graduated with honors, James had made another request. Would she come work at his restaurant, not as a lawyer, but as someone learning the business from its foundation? Would she be willing to start at the very bottom, to understand every role and every challenge, so that someday, when the time was right, she could run Belvedere with the wisdom that came only from having walked every path? Grace had agreed, understanding that this was his way of testing her, preparing her, ensuring that she would value every person who worked in the building regardless of their title or their skin color. She had shown up for her first day of work and never corrected anyone who assumed she was just another employee desperate for a job. The tension in Belvedere had been building for months, ever since James Thornton's death 3 months ago. He had passed quietly in his sleep, his body finally surrendering to the illness he had hidden from most of the staff, and his funeral had been attended by half the city's culinary establishment, all of them sharing stories about his generosity and his commitment to excellence. Richard had attended wearing black in an expression of appropriate sadness, but Grace had seen him checking his phone during the service, had watched him networking with other restaurant owners at the reception afterward, already positioning himself for what he clearly believed would be his assumption of total control. In the weeks following Jameis' death, Richard had become bolder in his treatment of staff, particularly those he considered expendable. He announced pay cuts for kitchen support staff, claiming the restaurant needed to trim expenses during the transition period. He fired an older line cook who had been with Belvedere for 12 years, citing performance issues that no one else had ever noticed. He began talking openly about selling some of Jameis' personal collection, the vintage photographs and artwork that decorated the walls, pieces that James had chosen specifically because they represented the neighborhood's history and the diverse community that surrounded the restaurant. Grace watched these changes with the patient attention of someone observing a storm from a secure shelter, knowing that the winds would eventually shift. She had received the call from Attorney Chen 4 weeks ago, the lawyer's voice calm and professional as he explained that Jameis had finally cleared probate, that the documents were ready for filing, that Grace needed only to give the word and everything would be set in motion. She had asked him to wait, to let her choose the precise moment when the truth would emerge, because after 20 years of watching and learning, she understood that timing was everything. Grace kept her most important possessions in a worn leather satchel that she stored in her locker in the staff room, a bag that had belonged to her mother and that showed its age in the softness of its handles and the scratches across its surface. Inside that bag rested documents that would transform Belvedere's future in a matter of hours. The will that Attorney Chen had prepared for filing, authenticated by 3 witnesses and sealed by the county probate court, named Grace Elizabeth Thornton as Jameis' legally adopted daughter, a process that had been completed 24 years ago through private proceedings that left no public record. The will bequeathed to her 51% of Belvedere's ownership, along with a letter from James explaining his reasoning, his love for her as a daughter, and his absolute confidence in her ability to lead the restaurant according to the principles they both shared. Additional folders contained documentation Grace had compiled over the past 5 years, a meticulous record of Richard's violations. Photographs of altered invoices showing how he purchased cheap ingredients but billed the restaurant for premium products, pocketing the difference. Copies of employee time cards that had been modified to reduce overtime payments, with the original versions she had quietly preserved. Video footage from the security system that Richard did not know she had access to, showing him removing cash from the register after closing and walking out with bottles of expensive wine that never appeared on any sales record or inventory sheet. Emails between Richard and Sarah discussing which employees to target for termination based on criteria that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with who'd be most likely to accept mistreatment without complaint. Grace had even documented the health code violations, the instances where Richard had instructed kitchen staff to use ingredients past their expiration dates, the times he had disconnected the temperature alarm in the walk-in cooler to save money on repairs. She had built a case that would satisfy any labor board, any health inspector, any prosecutor who might be interested in fraud charges, and she had done it all while maintaining her role as the invisible woman whom Richard believed posed no threat whatsoever. Richard walked past her locker that evening as she was preparing to leave, his jacket slung over his shoulder, his expression satisfied in a way that made Grace's stomach tighten. He paused, seeming to notice her for the first time all day, and his mouth curved into something that might have been a smile on a kinder face. "Still here, Grace. I would have thought someone your age might want to start thinking about retirement. Find something a little less demanding. than keeping up with a restaurant like this." His tone carried the false sweetness of poison mixed with honey. "We might be making some staffing changes, soon streamlining our operations, so do not get too comfortable." Grace met his eyes, her expression neutral, her voice steady. "I have been here 20 years, Mr. Caldwell. I will be here as long as Belvedere needs me." Richard laughed, a short bark of sound without humor. "That is adorable, really. But you might want to start looking at your options, just in case." He walked away, whistling softly, leaving Grace standing beside her locker with her hand resting on the leather satchel, feeling the weight of justice waiting inside. Marka had started at Belvedere 6 years ago, a young culinary school graduate with dreams bigger than his bank account and hands that shook slightly during his first week on the line. Grace remembered watching him struggle with the pace, seeing the panic in his eyes when orders backed up during a Saturday dinner rush, the way the other cooks had rolled their eyes and muttered about inexperienced kids who could not handle pressure. She had stayed late that night after her shift ended, helping him prep vegetables for the next day, showing him the shortcuts that would save him precious seconds, teaching him the rhythm that turned chaos into flow. He had looked at her with confusion at first, wondering why someone whose job title did not include training would bother helping him. But Grace had simply smiled and told him that everyone at Belvedere was part of the same family, that they succeeded or failed together. Over the years, Marcus had grown into one of the most talented chefs in the kitchen, his creativity with seasonal ingredients earning praise from critics and customers alike, his work ethic and kindness making him beloved among the staff. He had never forgotten Grace's early support, and even as Richard tried to enforce artificial hierarchies and divisions, Marcus continued to treat her with the respect and gratitude she deserved. When Richard arrived and began implementing his vision of efficiency and profitability, Marcus had been among the first to voice concerns about the quality compromises and the mistreatment of staff. He had learned quickly that dissent was not tolerated, that questioning Richard's decisions resulted in reduced hours and veiled threats about the abundance of young chefs, desperate for jobs in the current market. Now Marcus moved through the kitchen with quiet fury, his jaw tight as he watched Richard's latest cruelties unfold, but he had a family to feed and student loans that would take another decade to repay, so he kept his head down and cooked perfect plates while his conscience burned. Richard convened a mandatory staff meeting on a Tuesday morning, requiring everyone to arrive 2 hours before the restaurant opened for lunch service, though he made clear these hours would not be paid, since they were considered informational rather than actual work time. The staff gathered in the main dining room, servers and cooks and dishwashers standing in uncomfortable clusters, while Richard stood near the bar with Sarah at his side, both of them wearing expressions of barely contained satisfaction. Richard began with announcements about new efficiency measures, his voice carrying the false cheerfulness of someone delivering news he believed to be generous rather than cruel. The restaurant had been operating with what he called excessive labor costs, supporting staff members whose contributions did not justify their compensation, maintaining positions that modern operations had long since streamlined away. Effective immediately, several roles would be eliminated or consolidated, with the affected employees receiving notice by the end of the week. Grace stood near the back, her arms crossed, watching the faces around her fall as they calculated their own vulnerability. Richard continued, explaining that the remaining staff would need to demonstrate increased flexibility and commitment, that the successful operation of a premium establishment required sacrifice from everyone, though somehow his own salary and benefits never seemed to fall under the category of necessary sacrifice. He announced wage reductions for kitchen support staff, cutting their hourly pay by $2.40 across the board, justified by what he claimed were industry-wide adjustments to labor costs in response to economic pressures. The servers, predominantly white women whom Richard had hired personally over the past 2 years, would maintain their current compensation. He noted with a smile toward Sarah, who nodded approvingly. Marcus raised his hand, his voice steady despite the anger evident in his shoulders. Mr. Caldwell, these cuts will put some people below minimum wage when you account for the hours we actually work versus what gets recorded. Richard's smile did not waver. Then I suggest people work more efficiently so they can complete their tasks within recorded hours. No one is forcing anyone to stay here. There are always other opportunities for those who find our requirements unreasonable. The exploitation intensified over the following weeks in ways both obvious and insidious, a systematic dismantling of the protections and dignities that James Thornton had built into Belvedere's culture. Richard began selling off pieces of the restaurant's soul, the artwork that James had collected over decades disappearing from walls and being replaced with cheaper prints, the antique bar mirrors that had witnessed countless celebrations and conversations vanishing overnight and being replaced with modern fixtures that looked sterile and cold. He claimed these were aesthetic updates, part of his modernization vision, but Grace knew he was liquidating assets to fund his own lifestyle and his plan to buy out the remaining shareholders. She had begun her documentation years ago, but now she worked with renewed urgency, arriving early each morning to photograph inventory before it disappeared, comparing the restaurant's recorded purchases with what actually arrived from suppliers, documenting the difference between premium ingredients that Belvedere was billed for and the inferior substitutes that Richard's chosen vendors actually delivered. She had created a system of encrypted files on a laptop she kept at home, organizing evidence by category with dates and cross-references that would satisfy any investigator. Late one Thursday evening, after the last customers had departed and most of the staff had left, Grace remained behind under the pretense of deep cleaning the dry storage area. She heard Richard's office door close, heard the distinctive sound of the safe being opened, the safe that only Richard and the accountant were supposed to access. Grace had discovered months ago that the security camera system, which Richard believed he controlled completely, actually had a secondary feed that James had installed years earlier for redundancy, a feed that recorded to a hidden server in the basement and that Grace had quietly maintained. She pulled out her phone, navigating to the monitoring app that gave her access to that feed, and watched in real time as Richard removed cash from the safe, counted it carefully, and transferred it to his briefcase before closing everything back up and leaving through the rear exit. Grace downloaded the footage, added it to her growing collection, and returned to her cleaning with the patient satisfaction of someone watching a trap close exactly as designed. Sarah had become Richard's most enthusiastic enforcer, taking particular pleasure in her role as the unofficial enforcer of the new hierarchy. She made sure that Grace and the other workers Richard had targeted understood their diminished status through 1,000 small cruelties delivered with a smile. When customers asked Grace questions about the menu or the restaurant's history, Sarah would interrupt to say that she could provide better information, that Grace was not really the appropriate person to discuss such matters with guests. During shift changes, Sarah would loudly discuss weekend plans with the other favored servers, making sure to mention the generous tips and the easy schedules they received, speaking just loud enough for the kitchen staff and cleaning crew to hear about the inequality they could do nothing to challenge. She had joined Belvedere 18 months ago with a resume that claimed fine dining experience from establishments in California, though Grace had quietly verified that most of those restaurants had no record of employing anyone by Sarah's name during the years she claimed. Richard had hired her anyway after a single interview, seemingly charmed by her appearance and her obvious willingness to embrace his management philosophy. Sarah understood instinctively that her position depended entirely on Richard's continued favor, so she worked to prove her loyalty through her treatment of those he disdained. When a young server named Jennifer, a black woman who had recently graduated from culinary school and taken a position at Belvedere to gain experience, received compliments from a regular customer about her knowledge and professionalism, Sarah had gone directly to Richard with manufactured complaints about Jennifer's attitude and performance. Within a week, Jennifer was terminated, given a written notice that cited violations of service standards that she had never been warned about, and that seemed to contradict the positive feedback she had been receiving from customers and from Marcus. Jennifer had looked at Grace on her last day, tears streaming down her face, asking what she had done wrong, and Grace had held her hands and promised that injustice always contained the seeds of its own destruction, that patience and truth eventually prevailed even when the weight seemed unbearable. The microaggressions accumulated like poison in the bloodstream, individually small enough to dismiss, but collectively creating an environment of constant dehumanization. Richard made a point of never using Grace's name when other people were present, referring to her as the cleaning woman, or that older lady, or sometimes just pointing in her direction without verbal acknowledgement at all. When the staff gathered for the brief, pre-service meetings that Richard had instituted, he would ask for input from the servers and the cooks, making eye contact with each of them, nodding thoughtfully at their suggestions. But his eyes would slide past Grace as if she were part of the furniture, her raised hand invisible in his carefully curated peripheral vision. He critiqued her clothing, suggesting that she looked shabby and that perhaps she should invest in a more professional appearance, though he had simultaneously cut her hours to the point where she barely earned enough to cover her rent and groceries. When customers praised the meal, Richard would gather the culinary team for acknowledgement, calling Marcus and the line cooks to the dining room for applause and gratitude. But Grace, who had spent hours that morning selecting perfect produce at the market and preparing mise en place that made their cooking possible, remained invisible in the kitchen, her contributions erased from the narrative of excellence. Marcus witnessed these exclusions with increasing frustration, trying when he could to redirect credit, to mention Grace's work, to insist on her inclusion. But Richard had perfected the art of selective deafness, hearing what served his purposes and dismissing everything else. The other staff members, those who depended on Richard's approval for their schedules and their livelihoods, learned to mirror his blindness, to step around Grace in hallways without greeting her, to discuss restaurant business as if she were not standing 3 feet away listening to every word. Grace absorbed it all with the discipline of someone who understood that every indignity was evidence, every slight a thread in a larger pattern that would eventually be presented in a context where Richard's power to control the narrative would be stripped away completely. Richard escalated his campaign of economic intimidation as summer turned to fall, using Grace's age as a weapon he wielded with increasing brazenness. He called her into his office one morning, not bothering to invite her to sit, keeping her standing in front of his desk like a student called before a principal. He spoke about the changing restaurant industry, about how physical demands required stamina that naturally declined with age, about how he had a responsibility to ensure that every position was filled with someone capable of meeting the high standards Belvedere required. Grace was 55 years old, he noted, as if she might have forgotten, an age when many people began thinking about retirement and rest. He wanted to be supportive of her transition into that next phase of life, he claimed, his tone suggesting magnanimity, rather than the threat that underlay every word. Of course, he continued, if she chose to leave voluntarily, there would be a modest severance package, perhaps 2 weeks of pay, a generous gesture considering that she had no formal contract guaranteeing any such benefit. If she waited until he was forced to make more difficult decisions about staffing, well, those departures might not include any severance at all. Grace had listened without interruption, her face revealing nothing, and when Richard finally finished his performance, she had simply asked if there was anything else he needed. The question seemed to frustrate him, as if he had expected fear or tears or desperate pleading. He waved her away, turning his attention to his computer screen with exaggerated disinterest. Grace returned to her work, but that evening she calculated her expenses again, looked at her bank account, and confronted the reality that Richard had engineered. He had reduced her hours to 28 per week, just below the threshold that would require him to provide health insurance or other benefits. She had taken a second job cleaning offices 3 nights a week, working from 11 at night until 3 in the morning, coming home to sleep for 3 hours before starting her day at Belvedere. Her body ached constantly, her knees protesting the endless standing and kneeling, her hands cramping from the repetitive motions. She sent money to her sister to help with her niece's college expenses, paid rent on her small apartment, bought groceries carefully from discount stores, and still found herself calculating whether she could afford to replace her worn-out shoes or if they would last another month. Grace had reached out quietly to the other minority shareholders in the weeks following Jameis' death, hoping to find allies who shared her concerns about Richard's management and his obvious plans to consolidate power. She scheduled coffee meetings with Jameis' nephew, who owned 8% of the company, a quiet man in his 40s who worked as an architect and had always seemed more interested in his uncle's well-being than in the restaurant business itself. She explained her observations about Richard's financial irregularities, showed him documentation of missing inventory and altered records, suggested that they might work together to call for an audit or to demand greater transparency in operations. He had listened politely, nodding in appropriate places, but when Grace finished, he had sighed and explained that he was not interested in conflict. Richard had already approached him about buying his shares, offering a price that seemed fair, and frankly, he needed the money for his own business ventures and did not have time to get involved in restaurant politics. Grace had tried again with the family friend who owned 5%, a woman who had invested decades ago as a favor to James during a difficult financial period. That conversation had ended even more quickly, the woman explaining nervously that Richard had made it very clear that anyone who caused problems would find themselves tied up in expensive legal battles that could drag on for years. She was 72 years old, she did not have years to spare, and she just wanted to sell her shares and be done with the whole situation. Grace had left these meetings feeling the weight of isolation, understanding that Richard had methodically eliminated every obvious avenue of resistance, that he had studied the landscape and neutralized potential threats before they could organize. She had considered going to the labor board with her documentation of wage violations and discrimination, had even called their office and spoken with an intake specialist who had been sympathetic but ultimately discouraging. Without multiple employees willing to testify, without a clear paper trail showing intentional rather than negligent violations, without the kind of smoking gun evidence that made cases simple rather than complicated, the specialist explained, these cases often became he said, she said battles that could take years to resolve and rarely resulted in meaningful consequences. Grace had thanked her for the information and hung up, sitting in her small apartment, and staring at the folders of evidence she had compiled, wondering if she had miscalculated, if her patient approach had allowed Richard to become too powerful to challenge. Then she remembered the leather satchel in her locker, remembered the will that Attorney Chen was holding, remembered that she was not trying to fight Richard with the limited weapons of an exploited employee, but was instead waiting for the precise moment when she could reveal that the entire playing field had always been different than he imagined. Richard's confidence had grown into something approaching arrogance bordering on recklessness, his sense of invulnerability making him careless in ways that Grace observed and catalogued with quiet satisfaction. He threw a party at Belvedere on a Monday evening when the restaurant was normally closed, inviting business associates and friends, using the space as if it were already his personal property rather than a business with multiple stakeholders. He had the kitchen staff prepare an elaborate tasting menu, sent out invitations on heavy cardstock that identified him as owner and operator despite the fact that he legally held only 35% of shares. Grace worked that night serving drinks and clearing plates, moving through the crowd of well-dressed guests who barely acknowledged her presence except to hand her empty glasses or point towards spills that needed attention. She listened to Richard hold court near the bar, his voice loud with alcohol and self-satisfaction, telling stories about his plans for Belvedere's future. He would be expanding to a second location within the year, he announced, once he had finalized the ownership transition. He was already in talks with investors, already scouting properties in the neighboring upscale district. Someone asked about the current staff, whether his key people would move with him to the new location, and Richard had laughed, saying that most of the current staff were replaceable, that he would build his new team from scratch with people who shared his vision, rather than clinging to outdated notions of how restaurants should operate. He gestured toward Grace as she passed, still laughing. "See that woman? She has worked here for 20 years doing essentially the same tasks, never advancing, never developing new skills. That is exactly the kind of complacency I am eliminating. The new Belvedere will be dynamic, hungry, young." Several guests had looked uncomfortable at this casual cruelty, but no one challenged him, and Richard seemed to interpret their silence as agreement. Grace had continued moving through the room, collecting glasses and wiping tables, her expression neutral, but inside she felt the cold clarity of someone watching an enemy walk confidently toward a cliff edge while believing himself to be ascending a mountain. The final provocation came on a Wednesday morning in late October, the first truly cold day of autumn, with frost on the windows and a wind that cut through insufficient jackets. Grace arrived at 6 to begin prep work, her body tired from 3 hours of sleep after her night shift at the office building. She moved through her morning routine, checking inventory, starting coffee, unlocking the storage areas, the familiar tasks providing a meditative rhythm that helped her tired mind focus. Richard arrived at 8, which was unusual since he typically did not appear until 10 or later, and he carried with him an energy that Grace recognized as dangerous, the particular intensity of someone who had made a decision and was eager to implement it. He called an impromptu meeting, gathering the staff members who had already arrived, about a dozen people standing in the kitchen, looking confused and worried. Richard held a folder, and he began speaking about the need for difficult choices, about his responsibility as the leader to make decisions that protected the restaurant's future, even when those decisions were personally painful. Grace felt her muscles tense, sensing what was coming. Richard pulled a letter from the folder, unfolding it with theatrical slowness. He announced that he was terminating Grace's employment effective immediately, that after careful consideration he had determined that her position was no longer necessary and that the duties she performed could be distributed among other staff members. She would receive 1 week of severance pay, calculated based on her reduced hours from the past month, and she needed to collect her personal belongings and vacate the premises before the lunch service began. The kitchen fell silent, multiple staff members turning to stare at Richard with expressions of shock and anger. Marcus stepped forward, his voice shaking. "You cannot do this. Grace has been here longer than anyone. She knows this restaurant better than you ever will. This is completely unjust." Richard's smile was thin and cold. "I can do this, and I just did. This is my restaurant now, and I will run it as I see fit. Anyone who has a problem with my decisions is welcome to leave along with Grace." Sarah, who had been standing near the door, actually smiled, a small, satisfied curve of her lips that made Grace's stomach turn. Grace looked at the faces around her, at Marcus, whose hands were clenched into fists, at the line cooks and dishwashers whose eyes reflected helpless rage, at the servers who looked away because they were afraid. She walked over to Richard, standing directly in front of him, close enough that he took an involuntary half-step backward. She spoke quietly, her voice carrying a weight that made everyone lean in to hear. "Are you absolutely certain you want to do this, Mr. Caldwell?" Richard blinked, seemingly confused by her lack of tears or pleading. "I have never been more certain of anything." "You are finished here." Grace nodded slowly. "Then I think we need to have a conversation in your office. Right now, just the two of us." Richard laughed, looking around as if inviting others to share his amusement at this absurd request. "I do not think you are in a position to request private meetings." Grace did not move, did not raise her voice, but something in her eyes made Richard's laughter fade. "I am not requesting. I am informing you that you want to hear what I have to say before you proceed any further with this termination. We can do this privately in your office, or I can say it here in front of everyone, but either way, this conversation is happening." Richard stared at her, his face reddening, but after a long moment he jerked his head toward the stairs. 5 minutes, then you are out of here forever." Grace turned to Marcus, touched his arm gently. "It will be okay, trust me." Then she followed Richard toward the office, pulling her phone from her pocket and sending a single text message to Attorney Chen. The word was simple and final. Richard's office still carried traces of James Thornton's presence despite Richard's efforts to erase them. The mahogany desk that James had commissioned from a local craftsman 30 years ago. The view of the street below, where morning light filtered through trees that James had insisted the city preserve when the neighborhood began its transformation. Richard positioned himself behind the desk with the territorial aggression of someone claiming space he believed he had already conquered. His hands flat on the surface, his shoulders squared as if preparing for a confrontation he expected to win easily. Grace closed the door behind her with deliberate care, the soft click of the latch somehow more final than a slam would have been. She moved to stand directly across from Richard, separated only by the desk and by the vast gulf between what he believed to be true and what she was about to reveal. Her voice when she spoke was calm, almost conversational, the tone of someone discussing the weather rather than dismantling someone's entire understanding of reality. "Before I leave, Mr. Caldwell, there are some things about the ownership structure of this restaurant that you should understand." Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression mixing irritation with amusement. "I know everything about the ownership structure. I own 35% with the remaining shares held by Thornton family members who are all eager to sell to me. Within a month, this will be entirely my restaurant." Grace reached into the bag she had brought with her, the leather satchel that had been her mother's, and withdrew a folder. "Actually, that is not accurate. Let me correct your understanding. I am the majority owner of Belvedere." Richard's laugh was genuine, reflexive, the sound of someone hearing something so absurd that it did not even register as a threat. "You are what, Grace? You are delusional. You are a cleaning woman. You own nothing." Grace placed the folder on the desk between them, opening it to reveal the first document, a will bearing the seal of the county probate court and the signatures of 3 witnesses. "I am the daughter of James Thornton, legally adopted 24 years ago through private proceedings. This is his last will and testament, authenticated by the court 2 weeks ago. He left me 51% of this restaurant." Richard's hand shot out to grab the document, his fingers trembling slightly as he scanned the pages, his eyes moving rapidly across text that his mind seemed unable to process. Grace watched his face cycle through emotions, disbelief melting into confusion, confusion hardening into panic as he checked the dates, the signatures, the official seals that marked every page as legitimate and binding. The will was exactly what she had claimed, dense legal language that nevertheless communicated its meaning with perfect clarity. James Arthur Thornton, being of sound mind and body, did hereby bequeath to Grace Elizabeth Thornton, his adopted daughter and the person he trusted above all others, to carry forward the values and vision upon which Belvedere was built. 51% ownership of said establishment along with all rights and responsibilities attendant to majority shareholder status. Richard read the passage 3 times, his lips moving slightly, his breathing becoming shallow. He looked up at Grace, his face pale beneath its usual tan. "This is impossible. James never mentioned a daughter. There was no adoption. This has to be forged." Grace reached into her folder again, producing additional documents. "Here is the adoption decree from the state of New York, dated June 15, 2001. Here are the court records showing the name change that made me legally Grace Elizabeth Thornton. Here is correspondence between James and his attorney discussing the adoption process and his wishes regarding eventual inheritance. Everything has been verified by the probate court, Mr. Caldwell. Multiple judges have reviewed these documents over the past 3 months. They are as real and as binding as anything can be in a legal system. Richard was shaking his head, a repetitive motion that seemed involuntary. But you have been working here as a cleaning woman for 20 years. Why would someone who owned the restaurant work as a cleaning person? This does not make any sense. Grace pulled out the chair across from Richard and sat down, her posture relaxed despite the tension radiating from the man across the desk. James wanted me to understand this business from the ground up. He paid for my education at Columbia Law School, Mr. Caldwell. I graduated with honors with a law degree specializing in corporate governance and contract law. After working at a firm for 5 years, I came here full-time to learn the restaurant industry by doing every job, understanding every challenge, seeing how the business functioned when you started at the foundation rather than at the top. James believed that real leadership required empathy and knowledge that could only come from having walked in the shoes of every person who works here. Richard's mouth opened and closed without sound, his brain clearly struggling to reconcile the woman he had dismissed and demeaned for 5 years with the image of a Columbia Law School graduate, an attorney. A person who had been observing and understanding everything, while he assumed she understood nothing. Grace continued, her voice gentle but implacable. So when you address me, the correct term is not cleaning woman. The correct term is owner. Or if you prefer, you may call me Miss Thornton. Richard found his voice, though it came out hoarse and uncertain. Even if this is true, even if you somehow own 51%, I still own 35%. I am still a major shareholder. Grace nodded. That is correct. You do own 35%, though I should mention that I also own an additional 8% that I purchased over the past 15 years through a holding company. James set aside money for me to acquire shares from departing investors, building my stakes slowly and privately. So my actual ownership is 59%. But yes, you do own 35%, which would normally entitle you to significant input into how this business operates. However, that brings us to the second part of this conversation. Grace withdrew another folder from her satchel, this one considerably thicker, organized with colored tabs and labeled sections that spoke to meticulous preparation. Over the past 5 years, I have documented your management of Belvedere with the thoroughness that my legal training taught me to apply to complex cases. I have evidence of systematic fraud, wage theft, discrimination, health code violations, and breach of fiduciary duty. Would you like me to walk you through the categories, or would you prefer to review the documentation yourself? She slid the folder across the desk. Richard stared at it as if it were a venomous snake, his hand hovering over the cover but not quite touching it. Grace did not wait for his decision, instead beginning to narrate the contents. Tab 1 contains photographs and corresponding invoices showing that you have billing the restaurant for premium ingredients while actually purchasing cheaper substitutes and pocketing the difference. Over 5 years, I calculate this fraud at approximately $230,000. Tab 2 documents wage theft, specifically your practice of editing employee time cards to reduce overtime payments and your requirement that staff work off the clock. This affects 17 current and former employees and represents roughly $85,000 in stolen wages. Tab 3 contains video footage from the security system showing you removing cash from the register and inventory from the wine cellar, neither of which appears in any sales records or personal purchase documentation. This constitutes embezzlement of approximately $50,000 over 3 years. Richard finally opened the folder, his hands shaking as he flipped through pages of evidence that Grace had compiled with prosecutorial precision. Each photograph was dated and cross-referenced. Each video clip had timestamps and corresponding inventory records. Each piece of documentation was organized to tell a story that would be immediately comprehensible to any investigator, any auditor, any jury. Grace continued, her voice never rising, never showing satisfaction or anger, simply presenting facts with the clinical detachment of an attorney laying out a case. Tab 4 addresses discrimination and hostile workplace environment. I have documented 47 instances of racial discrimination, including your pattern of firing or demoting Black and Latino employees while protecting white employees who committed similar or worse infractions. I have emails between you and Sarah discussing strategies to push out older workers and people of color. I have testimony from terminated employees, several of whom have agreed to testify if cases proceed to court or to labor board hearings. Tab 5 covers health code violations, instances where you instructed kitchen staff to use expired ingredients, where you disabled safety equipment to avoid repair costs, where you stored food at improper temperatures. Any one of these violations could result in the restaurant being closed by the health department. Collectively, they represent a pattern of willful endangerment of public health. Richard was no longer looking at the documents, his eyes fixed on the desk's surface, his face drained of color. Grace closed the folder gently. I have additional evidence that I have not included here, bank records that show suspicious transfers, communications with vendors that suggest kickback arrangements, tax documents that appear to have been falsified. I have spent 5 years building a case that would satisfy any prosecutor in this jurisdiction, and I have had that case reviewed by 3 different attorneys who all agree that the evidence would likely result in criminal convictions on multiple counts. The question now, Mr. Caldwell, is what happens next. Richard looked up, his eyes showing the desperate hope of someone seeking any possible escape route. What do you want? Grace considered the question, her expression thoughtful. What I want is for Belvedere to continue as the kind of restaurant that James Thornton built, a place that treats its employees with dignity, that values quality over profit margins, that serves the community rather than exploiting it. What I want is for the people who work here to receive fair wages and respect regardless of the color of their skin or the nature of their job titles. What I want is for you to understand that your behavior over the past 5 years has been not only illegal but deeply immoral, and that there are consequences for treating human beings as disposable resources. Richard was leaning forward now, his hands clasped together almost as if in prayer, his voice taking on a pleading quality that Grace had never heard from him before. Please, I will resign. I will sell you my shares. I will walk away quietly. Just do not go to the police. Grace shook her head slowly. It is not that simple. You have committed crimes that harmed real people. Maria lost her job and could not pay rent for 3 months because you fired her on false pretenses. David worked hundreds of hours of unpaid overtime because you edited his time cards. Jennifer's career in the restaurant industry was damaged because you blacklisted her with other employers. These are not abstract violations. They have names and faces and consequences. However, I am not interested in vengeance, Mr. Caldwell. I am interested in justice and in education. So here is what is going to happen. First, you are going to return every dollar you have stolen. All $230,000 from the ingredient fraud, all $85,000 in wage theft, all $50,000 in embezzlement. You have 1 week to liquidate whatever assets you need to liquidate to make full restitution. Second, you are going to personally apologize to every employee you have harmed, and you are going to provide written letters of reference correcting any false statements you made about their performance. Third, you are going to enter a 6-month program on workplace diversity and ethical management at your own expense, and you are going to provide me with proof of completion. Fourth, you are going to sign over your 35% ownership stake to a trust that will distribute those shares to long-term Belvedere employees over the next 5 years. You will receive fair market value for the shares, but you will no longer have any ownership interest in this restaurant. Richard opened his mouth to protest, but Grace held up her hand. I am not finished. If you comply with all of these requirements, if you demonstrate genuine remorse and genuine change, I will not file criminal charges with the district attorney's office. However, I have already contacted the IRS and the Department of Labor regarding certain financial irregularities. Those investigations are proceeding regardless of what you do, because tax fraud and labor violations are matters of public interest that I cannot simply ignore. You will have to cooperate with those investigations and accept whatever consequences they determine. If you refuse any part of this agreement, I will immediately file criminal charges and civil suits, and I will make sure that every restaurant owner in the city knows exactly what you did here. You will never work in this industry again. Richard sat in silence for nearly a full minute, his face cycling through expressions of rage and despair and calculation as he tried to identify some alternative path, some negotiating position that might give him leverage. Grace waited patiently, watching him arrive at the inevitable conclusion. Finally, he nodded, the motion small and defeated. I will do it, all of it. Grace stood, gathering her folders and returning them to her satchel. Good. We are going to go downstairs now, and you are going to explain to the staff that I am the new owner and that you are resigning effective immediately. You are going to do this with grace and without making excuses or trying to minimize what you have done. If you handle this professionally, we can both walk out of this office with some dignity intact. Grace opened the office door to find Marcus standing at the top of the stairs, his face anxious, his posture suggesting he had been debating whether to interrupt. Behind him, the other staff members who had been present for the termination scene were gathered, their expressions showing varying mixtures of anger, confusion, and hope. Grace smiled at Marcus, a warm, genuine smile that seemed to surprise him with its confidence. Could you gather everyone in the dining room, please? Mr. Caldwell and I have an announcement to make. Marcus looked past Grace to where Richard sat slumped behind the desk, then back to Grace, his eyes widening as he registered something different in her bearing, an authority that seemed to have manifested in the space of 20 minutes. He nodded and headed down the stairs, calling for the staff to assemble. Grace waited while Richard stood on shaking legs, straightening his shirt and running his hands through his hair in a futile attempt to regain some composure. They descended to the main dining room where approximately 15 people had gathered, with more arriving as word spread through the kitchen and storage areas. Grace walked to the center of the room, standing in a space where afternoon light illuminated her clearly while Richard remained near the edges, diminished and uncertain. Grace spoke clearly, her voice carrying to every corner without needing to shout. Thank you all for gathering on short notice. I know this morning has been confusing and upsetting. I want to explain what is happening and what it means for Belvedere going forward. 24 years ago, James Thornton legally adopted me as his daughter. He paid for my education, including a law degree from Columbia, and he asked me to work here at Belvedere to learn this business from the ground up. I have been here for 20 years, working alongside all of you, learning from all of you, and watching how this restaurant operates. James passed away 3 months ago, and his will, which cleared probate 2 weeks ago, left me 51% ownership of this restaurant. I am the majority owner of Belvedere. The room erupted in gasps and exclamations, heads turning to look at neighbors, people reaching out to steady themselves against tables. Marcus stood frozen, his mouth open, his eyes moving between Grace and Richard as years of observed behavior suddenly rearranged themselves into a pattern that finally made sense. Grace waited for the noise to subside before continuing. I have been documenting various violations and illegal practices that have occurred under Mr. Caldwell's management. He has agreed to resign his position immediately, to make full financial restitution to the employees he has harmed, and to transfer his ownership stake to a trust that will distribute shares to long-term Belvedere staff. He will not be returning to this restaurant after today. Richard, would you like to say anything? Every eye turned to Richard, who looked like a man standing before an execution squad. His voice, when he emerged, was barely above a whisper. I apologize for my actions and my treatment of the staff here. I have behaved badly, and I accept the consequences of my decisions. Then, without waiting for dismissal, he walked quickly toward the exit, his shoulders hunched, leaving behind the restaurant he had believed would make his fortune and his reputation. The door closed behind him with a soft sound that seemed to mark the end of an era. Grace turned back to the assembled staff. "I know you have questions, and I promise to answer all of them over the coming days. But right now, I want you to know that effective immediately, there are going to be changes. Everyone who has had wages stolen will receive full back pay within the week. Everyone who was fired unjustly will be offered their position back with an apology. We are implementing a transparent pay structure that ensures equity across all positions. We are creating a staff council that will have real input into how this restaurant operates. And we are recommitting to the values that James Thornton built this place on, values that honor every person who works here regardless their job title or the color of their skin." Marcus stepped forward, his voice thick with emotion. "Grace, all these years, you let him treat you like that. You let all of us think you were just another employee when you could have stopped it at any time." "Why?" Grace met his eyes, her expression gentle. "Because I needed to understand what was really happening. I needed to document it thoroughly enough that justice could be served. And I needed to know who among the staff had the integrity to stand up for what was right even when it was difficult and risky. You passed that test, Marcus. You all did." Her gesture encompassed the staff members who had protested Richard's cruelties, who had defended their coworkers, who had maintained their humanity in an environment that tried to strip it away. Sarah, who had been standing near the back, suddenly moved toward the exit, but Grace's voice stopped her. "Sarah, please stay. We need to discuss your employment status and certain emails that suggest you were actively participating in discrimination and harassment." Sarah froze, her face flushing red. But two line cooks had moved to block the door, their expressions making clear that Grace's request was not actually optional. The room fell silent again, everyone understanding that the reckoning Grace had brought to Richard was not yet complete, that accountability would extend to everyone who had chosen to profit from cruelty rather than resist it. Grace spent the next hour in detailed conversation with the staff, answering questions about the transition, explaining the legal processes that had brought them to this moment, listening to stories of mistreatment and resilience that people had been afraid to share before. She took notes on a legal pad, documenting who needed restitution and how much, creating a list of necessary changes to policies and procedures, gathering input about what would make Belvedere a genuinely equitable workplace. Attorney Chen arrived at 2 o'clock, carrying additional documentation and ready to oversee the formal transfer of management authority. Grace introduced him to the staff, explaining that he would be available to answer legal questions and to help coordinate the restitution process. Marcus pulled Grace aside during a quiet moment, his eyes still showing shock but also a growing understanding. "All those times you helped me when I was starting out, you were not just being kind. You were teaching me how a real leader behaves." Grace touched his arm gently. "You taught me too, Marcus. You showed me that there are people in this industry who value integrity over advancement, who will stand up for others, even when it costs them something. That is why I am promoting you to executive chef with a salary that reflects the actual value you bring to this restaurant and equity participation in the business." Marcus's eyes filled with tears. Grace shook her head. "You have earned every opportunity I am giving you. The question is, are you ready to help me build something better here?" Marcus wiped his eyes, his smile breaking through like sun after storm. "Absolutely, yes." Grace looked around the dining room at the faces that had become family over 20 years, at the restaurant that James had loved and that she had been preparing 2 decades to lead, at the possibility of transformation that seemed to shimmer in the air like heat rising from summer pavement. The afternoon light painted everything golden, and for the first time in 5 years, Grace felt the weight of surveillance and documentation lift from her shoulders, replaced by the equally heavy but far more welcome burden of leadership earned through patience, preparation, and an unshakable commitment to justice that transformed rather than simply punished. The week that followed Richard's departure moved with the disorienting speed of a life, reorganizing itself around principles rather than expedients. Grace found herself working 18-hour days, not from exploitation but from the urgent necessity of dismantling systems of harm and building frameworks of equity in their place. She met with each employee individually, sitting across from them in the small office that had been Richard's domain, and that she was already planning to convert into a staff break room with comfortable furniture and windows that actually opened to let in fresh air. These conversations followed a pattern that broke her heart and rebuilt it simultaneously. She would ask people to tell her their experiences, and they would begin hesitantly, testing whether this new reality was genuine or another manipulation. Then the stories would pour out in torrents of accumulated pain and suppressed dignity. Maria, who had been fired 6 months earlier for allegedly stealing tips that she had never touched, wept as she described losing her apartment and having to move her 2 children into her sister's already crowded home. David showed her his personal records of hours worked versus hours paid, a meticulous log he had kept for 2 years, documenting hundreds of hours of wage theft that had cost him nearly $12,000. Jennifer explained how Richard's false performance review had followed her to 3 other job interviews, poisoning her reputation in an industry where everyone seemed to know everyone else. Grace listened to each story with the attention it deserved, took notes, asked questions, and made commitments. She would make them whole financially. She would provide written corrections to any false documentation. She would serve as a reference for future employment. And she would ensure that Belvedere never again operated as a place where people's labor and dignity could be stolen with impunity. By Friday, she had written checks totaling over $300,000, drawing on the restaurant's reserves and on her personal accounts to ensure that restitution did not wait for Richard's asset liquidation. The money mattered, but what seemed to matter more to people was the acknowledgement, the fact that someone in power was finally saying that what happened to you was wrong, that you deserved better, that your value as a human being was not determined by your job title or your skin color. Grace implemented structural changes with the same urgency, working with Attorney Chen and with a consultant who specialized in equitable workplace design to create systems that would outlast any individual's leadership. The new compensation structure eliminated the artificial hierarchy that had separated front of house from back of house, that had valued customer-facing roles over the essential work of preparation and maintenance. Every position received a base wage that met the actual cost of living in the city, calculated not through industry standards that assumed poverty was acceptable, but through research into what people actually needed for housing, food, healthcare, and modest savings. Tips would be pooled and distributed based on hours worked rather than on position, ensuring that the kitchen staff and cleaning crew who made excellent service possible would share in the rewards that service generated. Beyond wages, Grace established a benefits package that reflected her understanding of what working families needed. Full health insurance starting immediately upon hire rather than after a probationary period. Paid sick leave that did not require doctors' notes or elaborate justifications, because people deserved to stay home when they were ill without fear of losing income. Childcare assistance for parents who struggled with the irregular schedules that restaurant work demanded. An education fund that would provide grants to any employee pursuing further training or education, whether in culinary arts or in completely different fields, because people's potential should not be limited by their current employment. Grace announced these changes in a staff meeting on Saturday morning, and the room sat in silence as she walked through each element, explaining the reasoning and the implementation timeline. When she finished, Marcus stood and began to applaud, and within seconds the entire staff was on their feet, some crying, some shouting questions, all of them radiating a disbelief that was slowly transforming into hope. One of the line cooks, a man named Carlos, who had worked at Belvedere for 8 years without ever speaking much in group settings, raised his hand tentatively. "Miss Grace, why are you doing all this? You could just pay us minimum wage and keep more profit for yourself." Grace looked at him steadily. "Because a business that profits from exploitation is not a business worth running. Because my father taught me that the true measure of a restaurant is not its Michelin stars, but how it treats the people who make those stars possible. Because justice is not just about punishing wrongdoing, but about building systems that make wrongdoing impossible." The creation of the Staff Council represented Grace's commitment to distributing power, rather than simply wielding it more benevolently than her predecessor. She worked with the employees to establish a democratic structure where representatives from each department, elected by their peers, would meet monthly with management to discuss operations, propose changes, and make decisions about issues that affected working conditions. The council would have real authority, not symbolic consultation, with the power to approve or reject proposed policy changes, to allocate a portion of the restaurant's budget towards staff priorities, and to participate in hiring decisions for management positions. Grace insisted that the council include members from every level of the restaurant hierarchy, that the voice of a dishwasher would carry equal weight to the voice of a sous chef, because wisdom about how to improve workplace culture came from lived experience rather than from titles. The first council election took place 2 weeks after Richard's departure, with candidates giving short speeches about their vision for Belvedere's future and staff members voting by secret ballot. Marcus won election as the kitchen representative. Maria, who had accepted Grace's offer to return to her serving position, was elected to represent front-of-house staff. Carlos became the representative for maintenance and support roles. When the council held its first official meeting, Grace attended as an observer rather than a leader, sitting in the back of the room and taking notes while the elected representatives discussed their priorities. They wanted better ventilation in the kitchen where summer temperatures regularly exceeded 90 degrees. They wanted a formal system for addressing customer complaints that protected staff from being blamed for issues beyond their control. They wanted a process for addressing interpersonal conflicts that focused on resolution rather than punishment. Grace listened, occasionally answering questions when asked for information, but mostly letting the council members discover their own authority, watching them realize that their opinions mattered and their decisions would be implemented. At the end of the meeting, Carlos turned to her with an expression of wonder. "This is real, is it not? You are actually going to let us make decisions about how this place runs." Grace smiled. "This is your workplace. These decisions should always have been yours to make. I am just trying to correct 20 years of someone telling you otherwise." Sarah's situation required a different kind of justice, one that balanced accountability with the possibility of redemption. Grace met with her privately, laying out the evidence of her participation in Richard's discrimination schemes, the emails where she had identified employees to target, the testimony from staff members about her enforcement of racist policies, the documented instances where she had manufactured complaints to justify terminations. Sarah sat across from Grace with her arms crossed defensively, her face cycling through denial and anger and fear. Grace spoke calmly, explaining that Sarah's employment was terminated effective immediately, that she would receive 2 weeks of severance despite having no legal entitlement to such payment, and that Grace would not pursue criminal charges or civil liability if Sarah met certain conditions. First, she needed to provide written apologies to every employee she had harmed, taking full responsibility for her actions without excuses or justifications. Second, she needed to complete a 6-month program on racial equity and workplace ethics, providing Grace with proof of attendance and completion. Third, she needed to refrain from seeking employment in the restaurant industry for 1 year, using that time to genuinely reflect on her behavior and its impact. If Sarah completed these requirements, Grace would provide a neutral employment reference that confirmed her dates of service and her position, but did not detail the reasons for her termination. If she refused or failed to complete the requirements, Grace would ensure that every restaurant owner in the city knew exactly why Sarah had been fired. Sarah tried to argue, to minimize her role, to claim she was just following Richard's instructions, but Grace cut through the deflection with laser precision. You made choices, Sarah. You chose to participate in cruelty because it benefited you. You chose your own comfort over other people's dignity. Those were your decisions, and you need to own them. But I am offering you something Richard never offered anyone he harmed, which is a chance to learn and change. The question is whether you will take that chance or whether you will continue to blame everyone except yourself. Sarah left with her termination letter and the requirements for redemption, her face pale but no longer defensive, perhaps beginning the difficult work of confronting who she had been and who she might choose to become. Richard's asset liquidation proceeded through legal channels over the following month, supervised by Attorney Chen and by a forensic accountant who verified every transaction to ensure full restitution. Richard sold his luxury car, his boat, his vacation property in the mountains, liquidating the symbols of success that he had purchased with stolen money. The funds were distributed to the employees he had harmed, with additional amounts going to the IRS and the Department of Labor as fines and back taxes. Richard also completed the required diversity training, attending sessions 3 times per week, where facilitators challenged his assumptions and forced him to confront the harm his prejudices had caused. Grace received reports from the program coordinator, who noted that Richard had progressed from angry defensiveness to reluctant participation to something that resembled genuine engagement with the material. In the final session, Richard was required to write a letter reflecting on what he had learned, and the coordinator forwarded a copy to Grace with a note that while transformation was impossible to guarantee, the letter suggested someone beginning to understand the magnitude of his failures. Grace read Richard's words carefully, his admission that he had viewed employees as resources rather than as people, his acknowledgement that his racial biases had blinded him to talent and humanity, his expression of shame about the lives he had damaged in pursuit of profit and status. The letter concluded with a commitment to spend the rest of his career, whatever form that took, working to repair the harm he had caused and to advocate for equity in whatever spaces he occupied. Grace filed the letter in her records, feeling neither satisfaction nor forgiveness, but rather a cautious hope that justice could sometimes produce education rather than simply punishment. She would watch Richard's future actions, and if he demonstrated genuine change, if he used his experience to prevent others from making similar choices, then perhaps some good could emerge from the wreckage of his time at Belvedere. 6 months after Grace assumed ownership, Belvedere was featured in a prominent food and culture magazine under the headline, "A Restaurant Revolutionized, How One Woman's Patience Delivered Justice." The article detailed Grace's story, from her adoption by James Thornton through her years of patient documentation to the dramatic revelation that had transformed the restaurant's culture. The journalist had interviewed staff members, all of whom spoke about the change in their working conditions with voices thick with emotion. Marcus described how his creativity had flourished once he no longer had to work in fear, how the new menu he had developed incorporated techniques and ingredients he had never felt free to explore under Richard's cost-cutting regime. Maria talked about being able to pay her rent on time, about her children's relief at having stability again, about her restored sense of dignity. Carlos explained that for the first time in his 8 years at Belvedere, he felt seen and valued, that his suggestions about kitchen organization and equipment maintenance were not only heard but implemented. The article also explored the broader implications of Grace's approach to justice, interviewing labor advocates and business ethics professors who praised her model of restorative rather than purely punitive accountability. One professor noted that Grace had demonstrated how power could be used to transform systems rather than simply to change who benefited from exploitation, how she had chosen to build equity rather than to simply replace one hierarchy with another. The article concluded with Grace's reflection on what she hoped other business owners would learn from Belvedere's transformation. Every person who works for you is someone's parent or child, someone's friend or partner, someone with dreams and dignity that deserve respect regardless of their job title. If you build your success on their exploitation, you are not a successful business owner. You are just another person choosing cruelty over justice. But if you build your business on equity and respect, if you share both risk and reward, you will discover that treating people well is not just morally right but economically smart, because people who are valued work with passion and commitment that no amount of fear or manipulation can ever produce. The magazine article generated unexpected attention, with restaurant owners from across the country reaching out to ask Grace about her model, about how they could implement similar structures in their own establishments. Grace began conducting workshops on equitable restaurant management, partnering with culinary schools and industry associations to spread the principles that James had taught her and that she had spent 20 years learning to implement. She talked about transparent pay structures and profit sharing, about the importance of giving workers genuine voice in operations, about how to document and address discrimination before it became entrenched in organizational culture. Some owners pushed back, arguing that restaurants operated on thin margins that could not support higher wages or better benefits, and Grace would respond with data from Belvedere's financial records showing that their labor costs had increased by 30%, but their overall profitability had increased by 40% because reduced turnover, higher morale, and better service had attracted more customers and generated stronger loyalty. She challenged the assumption that exploitation was necessary for survival, arguing instead that the industry had normalized poverty, wages, and poor working conditions to the point where many owners genuinely believed there was no alternative. But there was an alternative, Grace insisted, and Belvedere was proving it every day. Marcus stood beside her at many of these workshops, talking about how the creative freedom and economic security he now enjoyed had made him a better chef, how the collaborative culture meant that innovation came from every member of the kitchen staff rather than just from management, how pride in their workplace translated into excellence in every dish they served. Together, they were building a movement, slow and patient like everything Grace had ever done, but growing steadily as more people recognized that the restaurant industry could be a place of dignity and opportunity rather than exploitation and despair. Grace thought often of James during those months, wishing he could see what his patience and faith had produced, knowing that he had understood all along that real change required time and foundation and the courage to believe that justice was worth waiting for. The transformation of Belvedere rippled outward in ways that Grace had not anticipated, creating what the community organizers who contacted her called a demonstration effect that inspired workers in other restaurants to demand better conditions. Staff members from establishments throughout the city began reaching out, asking how they could organize, how they could document violations, how they could build power to challenge exploitation. Grace made herself available for consultations, connecting people with labor attorneys and union organizers, sharing the documentation strategies she had developed over 5 years of patient evidence gathering. 3 restaurants in the neighborhood implemented staff councils modeled on Belvedere's structure. 2 others adopted transparent pay scales after their employees presented management with data about Belvedere's improved profitability under equitable compensation. 1 high-end establishment, after losing multiple staff members to Belvedere, conducted an internal audit that revealed their own management had been engaging in wage theft, and the owner reached out to Grace for guidance on making restitution and rebuilding trust. The local culinary workers union, which had struggled for years to organize restaurant employees in a sector known for high turnover and employer intimidation, experienced a surge in membership as workers recognized that collective action was possible and effective. Grace spoke at a union meeting, sharing her story and encouraging workers to document everything, to support each other, and to remember that justice required both patience and persistence. The room was packed, people standing along the walls and sitting in the aisles, all of them hungry for the message that their dignity mattered, that exploitation was not inevitable, that change was possible if they were willing to work for it. As Grace looked out at those faces, representing every ethnicity and age and background, all unified in their desire for respect and fairness, she felt the weight of responsibility that came with having power and the profound satisfaction of using that power to lift others rather than to elevate herself. 1 year after assuming ownership, Grace stood in Belvedere during the dinner service on a busy Saturday night, watching the dining room flow with the orchestrated grace that came from a team working in genuine harmony. Servers moved between tables with confidence born from knowing they were valued and protected. Kitchen staff called out orders with energy that reflected pride in their work rather than fear of punishment. Customers lingered over meals, responding to the atmosphere of contentment and excellence that permeated the space. Marcus emerged from the kitchen carrying a new dessert he had developed, eager for Grace's opinion, and she tasted it carefully, noting the perfect balance of flavors, the technical precision that spoke to his growing mastery. "This is extraordinary, Marcus." James would have loved it. Marcus smiled, his expression mixing pride with the bittersweet acknowledgement of absence. "I wish he could have seen all of this, seen what you built." Grace shook her head gently. "We built it together. You and Maria and Carlos and everyone who chose to stay and to believe that this place could be different. I just provided the opportunity. The real transformation came from all of you deciding that dignity mattered more than fear." She walked to the front windows, looking out at the street where people passed by on their evening routines, where life continued its endless variation of joy and struggle, where justice was always incomplete, but never impossible if enough people committed to pursuing it. Grace thought about the long years of patience, about the accumulated indignities she had endured while building her case, about the moment when Richard's certainty had crumbled in the face of evidence he could not deny. She thought about the staff members whose lives had changed because someone had finally acknowledged their worth, about the ripples spreading through an industry that had normalized cruelty for too long, about the legacy that James had entrusted to her and that she was working every day to honor. The restaurant closed at 11, and Grace stayed late as she always did, walking through the empty dining room and kitchen, checking that everything was secure and clean, touching the walls that held 20 years of her history. She stopped in front of the framed uniform that hung in her office, the simple black shirt and pants she had worn for 2 decades, while people assumed she was invisible, while she was actually seeing everything. That uniform represented who she had been, but more importantly, it represented the truth that every person deserved respect regardless of what they wore or what their job title said, or what assumptions people made about their value. Grace locked the restaurant door behind her and walked into the cool night air, feeling the satisfaction that came from work that mattered, from justice that transformed rather than simply punished, from a future that held possibility because people had chosen courage over comfort. Her phone buzzed with a text from Attorney Chen, confirming that the final legal paperwork had been filed, that Richard had completed all requirements of their agreement, that the chapter of exploitation was officially closed. Grace sent back a brief response thanking him for his partnership, then added a line that captured everything she had learned from James and from 20 years of patient observation. Justice is not always fast, but if you prepare thoroughly and act decisively when the moment comes, it can be transformative. She thought about the staff members who would arrive tomorrow for their shifts, who would work in dignity and earn fair wages, who would have voice in decisions that affected their lives, who would build careers rather than simply survive jobs. She thought about the young people who might choose the restaurant industry because places like Belvedere proved it could be a field of opportunity rather than exploitation. She thought about Richard, who had lost his position and his assets, but had been given the chance to learn and change, to spend his future preventing the harm he had once caused. She thought about Sarah, who might or might not choose redemption, but who had at least been offered that choice. She thought about James, whose wisdom and faith had made all of this possible, who had understood that real leadership meant preparing others to succeed rather than hoarding power and credit. Grace pulled out her keys and walked toward her car, already thinking about tomorrow's work, about the workshop she would conduct next week for restaurant owners seeking to build equity into their operations, about the employee who had asked to meet with her to discuss pursuing a business degree with support from the education fund. The work was never finished, she knew, because justice was not a destination but a practice, not a moment but a commitment renewed daily through countless small choices that accumulated into transformation. But tonight, walking through the quiet streets of a neighborhood that James had loved and that she had committed her life to serving, Grace felt the deep satisfaction of knowing that she had kept faith with everything he had taught her, that Belvedere had become exactly what he had dreamed it could be, a place where excellence and equity were not competing values, but essential partners in the pursuit of work that honored every person it touched. Have you ever experienced a situation where someone underestimated you or where you witnessed injustice in your workplace? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might inspire someone else who is facing similar challenges. And if this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story about people who refused to accept injustice and who found the courage to fight for what was right. Speaking of courage and unexpected victories, we have another incredible story waiting for you right now. Click on the video appearing on your screen to discover what happens when someone everyone dismissed as powerless reveals they had been holding all the cards from the very beginning. You will not want to miss it. Drop a comment 20 if you believe patience and preparation can defeat injustice. 20 years she worked in silence, documenting every wrong, waiting for the perfect moment to deliver justice.